Dr. Elliot Graves woke up expecting his usual quiet Sunday, the kind where his wife had coffee ready by 7, the newspaper folded precisely on his side of the table, and the house arranged around his preferences like a museum curated for one man's comfort. Instead, he found her wedding ring sitting in the center of a blank white notepad. No note, no explanation. Just the ring and the faint smell of her perfume already going cold in the air. She had been gone for hours before he even noticed. Her name was Adrienne Graves, née Bouchard, and she had spent 6 years learning how to disappear inside a life that looked perfect from the outside. She was 31 years old, a former hospital administrator, who had given up her career when Elliot decided her working late created too many variables he couldn't control. She had a laugh that made strangers turn around in restaurants, and she had learned to laugh very quietly so he wouldn't ask what was so funny. Elliot was an orthopedic surgeon. Chicago's North Shore circuit treated him like a minor deity. Charity galas, hospital board meetings, magazine features about innovation in sports medicine. He was the kind of man who smiled for photographs with the practiced ease of someone who had learned early. That charm was just another tool for getting what he wanted. Behind the stone walls of their Lincoln Park home, he was something else entirely. She had moved through their mornings like someone counting exits. 40 steps from the master bedroom to the kitchen. 11 seconds for the elevator if she pressed the button before he called for her. She knew which floorboards creaked, which rooms had the best acoustics for raised voices, and how long it typically took for his mood to shift after a difficult surgery. She had been counting something else too. The morning he discovered her ring on that notepad, Elliot did what men like him always do first. He tried to solve it like an inconvenience. He called her phone. Disconnected. He checked their joint accounts. Closed. He looked through her closet and found gaps in the clothing, deliberate and careful, the kind of packing that takes weeks of planning one item at a time. His second call was to her younger sister, Petra Bouchard, a tax attorney who lived in Nashville and who Elliot had spent 6 years systematically discouraging Adrienne from visiting. Put her on the phone. No greeting, no softness. She's not here, Elliot. Petra's voice was flat and steady in a way that told him she was not surprised. She called you, don't lie to me, she always calls you. A pause. Then, she's not here. He hung up and stood in the kitchen holding his phone until his knuckles went pale. Somewhere in the calculation of his panic, something shifted from concern into fury. How dare she? After everything, after the life he had built her, after the patience he had shown, the standards he had maintained, the effort it took to manage a household and a marriage and a career, when neither offered him adequate gratitude. He poured himself 2 inches of bourbon, and called his private investigator by 8 in the morning. What Elliot didn't know, what he couldn't have known, because he had spent 6 years making sure Adrienne had no resources, no allies, no secrets, was that she had been building a case against him for the better part of 3 years. The small safe behind her winter coats held a hard drive. The hard drive held video footage from 4 cameras she had installed in corners of the house he never thought to examine, blending into smoke detectors and book spines with the kind of patience only someone with nothing left to lose learns to develop. It held audio files from a device no larger than a shirt button. It held photographs of bruises documented monthly with clinical precision, date, location, and the specific lie she had used in public to explain each one. It held a letter from her OB/GYN, written carefully in medical language, about the visit 18 months ago, where Adrienne had come in for what the intake form listed as a fall but what the doctor's private notes described as something else entirely. She had sent copies of everything to 3 separate locations before she left. One to a cloud drive only Petra could access. One to an attorney in Milwaukee named Sable Okonkwo, who specialized in domestic violence cases, and who had been advising Adrienne quietly for almost 2 years, communicating only through encrypted messages on a phone Elliot had never seen. One to a journalist at the Chicago Tribune who had spent a year covering financial misconduct in the city's medical community, and who had been waiting, patiently, for Adrienne to be somewhere safe before she published. The first anonymous email reached Etiette's personal account at midnight 3 days after Adrienne's disappearance. It contained a single video clip, 47 seconds. Clear audio, clear image, no room for misinterpretation. He stared at the screen until the timestamp in the corner of the frame burned itself into his vision. The message below the clip read only, Day 1. He called his attorney at 12:30 in the morning. He called the hospital's PR director at 1. He spent the rest of the night building the version of events he would need people to believe. Adrienne had been unstable, fragile, prone to exaggeration. He had been nothing but devoted. Anyone who knew them would confirm it. By morning, his version of events was already irrelevant. Sable Okonkwo filed the civil suit at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. citing 6 years of documented physical and psychological abuse, medical records, financial coercion, and the deliberate professional sabotage of Adrian's career. The filing was 22 pages long and included an index of evidence that read like a decade of careful accounting. The hospital board received copies of the filing by noon. By 3 o'clock, the Tribune had published its piece under the byline of a journalist named Cassidy Hale, and it was the most read article on the site within an hour of going live. The headline was simple: Healing Hands, Hidden Violence. The Double Life of Chicago Surgeon Elliot Graves. Hale had interviewed 6 people. Former colleagues of Adrian's. A neighbor who had once called the non-emergency police line and been told there was nothing they could do. And a woman from Adrian's support group, whose name was withheld but whose testimony described seeing Adrian with bruised ribs at a meeting 2 years prior, struggling to sit down, insisting she had slipped on ice. Elliot's surgical privileges were suspended by the end of the week. His attorney advised him to say nothing publicly. He said quite a lot publicly. He gave a statement to a local news outlet that used the word devastated 3 times and called Adrian's disappearance a mental health crisis that he was desperately hoping to help her through. He had a colleague appear on his behalf who used words like stress and misunderstanding, and a man who gave everything to his patients. The colleague resigned from the hospital board the following morning. Meanwhile, Elliot's private investigator was doing what private investigators do: running searches, pulling records, mapping movement. He found something within 10 days that made him call Elliot with the peculiar carefulness of someone delivering information they'd rather not be responsible for. "She's not hiding, Dr. Graves. At least, someone who looks exactly like her isn't hiding. I pulled footage from a coffee shop in Nashville. The woman in the frame. She's the image of your wife." Elliot's hand tightened on his phone. "That's Petra, her sister." "Right," the investigator said slowly, "but there's a second woman, different day, same shop, also your wife's build. Also her face. They're sisters, they look alike." "Yes, the question is, which one have you been speaking to on the phone, and which one signed the lease on the apartment in Houston 2 months ago?" Elliot sat with this for a long time. He had called Petra repeatedly. Petra had answered. Calm, contained, never giving him anything useful. He had assumed it was because she knew where Adrian was and was protecting her. He had not considered the possibility that on at least some of those calls, the woman he was speaking to was not Petra at all. The twins had done this as children. Their mother had told Adrian once. Switched places on the first day of school. Fooled teachers for weeks. They had always been able to wear each other's voice like a second skin. He had never bothered to learn the difference. The footage of Adrian, the real Adrian, came from a pharmacy security camera in a small city 2 states away. She was alive. She looked different. Shorter hair, different clothes, a posture that was open in a way Elliot had never associated with his wife. The investigator had almost missed her because of that. She moved like someone who wasn't afraid of taking up space. By the time Elliot's attorney subpoenaed the pharmacy for the full footage, Adrian had already appeared voluntarily in front of a federal prosecutor. She walked in with Sable Okonkwo beside her, carrying a leather portfolio that held a copy of every document she had built over 3 years, and she sat down across from the prosecutor and a representative from the Illinois Department of Professional Regulation. And she told them everything, in the precise and unhurried manner of someone who has rehearsed this conversation 10,000 times in her head, and is finally saying it out loud. The prosecutor listened to her for 2 hours without interrupting. Elliot's surgical license was revoked 8 days later. What followed was the kind of collapse that happens when a man has spent years using institutional power as a shield and suddenly finds the institution has turned around. Hospital colleagues who had privately doubted Elliot for years began giving statements. A former scrub nurse described an incident in an operating room that had been quietly buried by HR. A resident named Marcus came forward to say Elliot had once told him that certain patients, lower income, less educated, were not worth the same standard of documentation. A billing specialist provided records suggesting that Elliot had authorized procedures on at least 11 patients that were medically unnecessary but financially lucrative. The criminal referral for healthcare fraud arrived the same week as the domestic violence charges. Elliot's attorney told him he was looking at federal exposure on multiple fronts. His personal assets were frozen as part of the fraud investigation. His medical malpractice insurance, which might have provided some coverage for civil liability, notified him that the policy did not cover intentional acts, and what had been documented was clearly intentional. He tried to contact Adrian. The messages went to Sable Okonkwo's office and were documented as potential evidence of witness tampering. He tried to contact Petra. The number he had been calling for weeks was disconnected. He did not know if it had ever belonged to Petra. Elliot's bail hearing was on a gray Thursday morning in November. He arrived in a suit that cost $4,000 and sat at the defense table looking like a man still waiting for someone to explain to him that there had been a mistake. There had been no mistake. The judge denied bail on the fraud charges, citing flight risk, and Elliot Graves, who had spent 6 years making someone else feel like they couldn't go anywhere, was taken into custody in the courtroom while photographers documented his expression from the gallery. Adrienne was not in the courtroom. She didn't need to be. She was in Nashville, in Petra's apartment, on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee she had made for herself, without thinking about whether it would displease anyone. She was wearing clothes she had chosen because she liked them. She was reading a novel she had started 3 weeks ago and expected to finish by the weekend, which was something she had not been able to plan for in years. The simple expectation of an uninterrupted weekend. She was not okay. She wanted to be clear about that, not to herself but in general. She was not okay the way people say you're okay when they mean healed. She woke up some nights listening for sounds that weren't there. She startled when doors closed too quickly. She was working with a therapist in Nashville named Dr. Renata Voss, who specialized in trauma and who had told Adrienne in their second session that rebuilding a sense of safety in one's own body after sustained abuse takes time measured in years, not weeks, and that there was no shortcut and no reason to pretend otherwise. Adrienne had cried for about 40 minutes after that session, and then gone to get lunch with Petra at a diner with blue vinyl booths and a jukebox, and they had talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with Elliot Graves, and it was the best afternoon Adrienne could remember in a very long time. Petra was the one who had coordinated most of it. That was the piece of the story Elliot would never fully understand, even after the prosecutor's timeline laid everything out in court. He had viewed Petra as a peripheral irritant, a sister Adrienne wasn't allowed to call too often, a mild inconvenience in the architecture of his control. He had never understood that the thing he was trying to suppress between the sisters had simply gone underground and become something far more deliberate. Petra had been the one to connect Adrienne with Sable Okonkwo. She had driven from Nashville to Chicago twice under the pretense of family visits to help Adrienne install the cameras, watching for Elliot's schedule, timing their movements down to the minute. She had kept copies of the documentation at her own office in a folder labeled with a client name that didn't exist. She had answered Elliot's calls after Adrienne left, imitating her sister's careful deference, giving him nothing while Adrienne put more distance between herself and the city. She had been 3 steps ahead of him the entire time, and he had never thought to look at her as a serious threat. Men like Elliot rarely considered what the women in the background were actually doing. The criminal trial lasted 11 days. Adrienne testified for 4 hours. She did not cry on the stand. She had cried enough, she told Dr. Voss later. She wanted to be precise. She wanted every date and every detail to land with the weight it deserved. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Elliot Graves was convicted on 7 counts, including aggravated domestic battery, financial coercion, and 3 counts of healthcare fraud. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Constance Mbeki, sentenced him to 19 years, without possibility of early release on the combined charges, noting in her remarks from the bench that the defendant had demonstrated throughout the proceeding a complete absence of accountability and a pattern of behavior that had caused significant, documented harm to multiple individuals over many years. He would be 63 years old before he was eligible for release consideration, and by then his medical license would be long expired, his reputation structurally demolished, and the world would have moved on entirely without him. In the gallery, a woman named Cassidy Hale, the Tribune journalist, wrote down the sentence in her notebook and then sat quietly for a moment before she left. Sable Okonkwo took Adrienne to dinner that evening. They sat at a corner table and ordered things that were expensive and wonderful and talked for a while about what came next. What came next was the Adrienne Bouchard Legal Fund, established 6 months after the verdict using a portion of the settlement Elliot was ordered to pay. The name used Adrienne's maiden name deliberately. The fund provided legal representation for domestic violence survivors who could not afford attorneys, with a specific focus on cases involving financially coercive abusers, the kind of men who controlled money as a primary tool of imprisonment, making escape feel economically impossible. Sable ran the fund's legal division. Petra sat on the board. Cassidy Hale wrote a follow-up piece in the Tribune about the fund's first year of operation that ran on a Sunday morning and generated more in donations than the fund had collected in the previous 3 months combined. In the first year, the fund assisted 43 women. In the second year, 91. By the third year, it had expanded to serve clients in 5 states, and it had partnered with a coalition of hospitals to develop training protocols for emergency room staff on identifying financial coercion in domestic violence presentations. A gap in clinical response that Adrienne had experienced firsthand when a nurse had asked her, gently and carefully, if she was safe at home, and Adrienne had said yes because she didn't have a bank account she controlled. And leaving had felt like a question she didn't know how to answer. Now the training taught nurses how to ask differently. Elliot watched none of this from his cell at a federal correctional institution in downstate Illinois. His visiting list was nearly empty. His former colleagues did not write. The hospital system had settled the malpractice claims out of court and released a statement, using the passive voice about events that had occurred within the organization, which was the institutional equivalent of a shrug. He had been powerful because the people around him had allowed him to be, had smoothed his path and explained away his behavior, and found it easier to accommodate his cruelty than to confront it. In the absence of that accommodation, he was simply a man in a cell with a lot of time to think about what he had done, which was not the same thing as actually thinking about it. Adrienne did not think about Elliot very often. This was something she noticed about 18 months after the verdict, with a kind of quiet surprise. She had gone most of a Tuesday without him crossing her mind at all. Dr. Voss told her that was healing. Adrienne wasn't sure what to call it. She called it Tuesday. She had started volunteering at a clinic in Nashville 2 mornings a week, helping patients navigate insurance paperwork and hospital billing. Skills she had developed in her years as a hospital administrator, which had not vanished just because someone had told her they weren't valuable. She was good at it. The clinic director had told her 3 times that they would hire her full-time if she ever wanted the position, and she was still thinking about it, which was itself a kind of miracle. The ability to think about wanting something without the immediate internal calculation of whether wanting it was allowed. She sat on Petra's back porch on the evening of the fund's 3-year anniversary and drank a glass of wine and watched the sun go down over Nashville in a wash of orange and rose. And she thought about the version of herself, who had stood in a $600,000 kitchen 6 years ago counting steps to the panic room, wearing makeup to cover what the makeup was covering, telling herself this was just a difficult season and it would pass. She thought about what she would tell that woman if she could. She didn't think she would say anything. She thought she would just sit with her, let her know that someone could see her, that she wasn't as invisible as she felt. That was the thing no one could take away. Not the ring, not the bank account, not the career, not the years. The thing that survived every attempt to diminish it. She had known, even in the worst of it, that something in her was worth protecting. She had built her exit around that belief before she had the language for it. She had counted steps toward the door before she knew she was counting. And one morning, she had walked out and kept walking, and the distance between herself and that house had become her life.